When someone finally walks away from a narcissistic relationship, the outside observer often assumes the narcissist anticipated it. After all, from the outside, it may look as though the narcissist was emotionally distant, even careless, but psychologically, something very different often happens in that first moment of separation. The narcissist experiences shock, not always the kind of shock that shows up in visible panic, but an internal disruption to the story they had been telling themselves about the relationship. Because in the narcissistic mind, control over the emotional environment is central. The narcissist organizes their relationships around a certain assumption that the other person will remain within their gravitational field, whether through admiration, guilt, obligation, or emotional attachment. The narcissist expects that the connection will continue to orbit around them. So when the empath finally walks away, truly walks away, not just threatens to leave, but withdraws emotionally and psychologically, it interrupts that expectation. And the interruption is deeply unsettling. From a psychological perspective, this moment challenges one of the core defenses that supports narcissistic behavior: the illusion of emotional authority. Narcissists often construct an internal belief that they are the central figure in the emotional lives of the people around them. Even when there is conflict, even when the relationship appears unstable, they assume that the other person is still fundamentally invested. This is why many narcissists become comfortable pushing boundaries over time. They test loyalty. They test patience. They test how far the other person will go to maintain the connection. Because empaths are often patient, compassionate, and deeply invested in understanding others, they frequently tolerate more than most people would. Tolerance can be misinterpreted. What the empath experiences as compassion, the narcissist may interpret as permanence. They begin to assume that no matter what happens, the other person will stay. That assumption becomes part of the narcissist's psychological structure. Then one day, the empath stops explaining, stops arguing, stops trying to repair what keeps breaking. They simply leave. In that moment, the narcissist is confronted with something unfamiliar, a loss of narrative control, the script they were following, where they remained the central figure, where the other person continued to respond emotionally, suddenly stops working. At first, the narcissist may not fully understand what has happened. They may interpret the departure as temporary. Perhaps they believe the empath will return after some time, after emotions cool down, after the usual cycle reestablishes itself. But the energy feels different. The empath is no longer negotiating. They are no longer asking for recognition or change. The emotional thread that once connected them to the narcissist begins to dissolve. This creates a subtle but powerful psychological disturbance, because the narcissist is used to influencing reactions. They are accustomed to provoking responses, whether admiration, anger, jealousy, or emotional debate. All of these responses confirm something important to them, that they still occupy psychological space in the other person's world. But when someone truly walks away, that response disappears. But when someone truly walks away, that response disappears. The silence that follows can be more unsettling than confrontation ever was. And this is the first moment where the narcissist's internal certainty begins to fracture. Not because they suddenly feel empathy or remorse, but because the dynamic they relied on has changed in a way they did not anticipate. Perhaps the first time in the relationship, they are no longer directing the emotional movement of the story. Someone else has stepped out of it entirely. And when that happens, the narcissist is left facing a reality they rarely prepare for. The possibility that the person they assumed would always stay has already chosen a different path. Because the most destabilizing moment for a narcissistic mind is not when someone argues with them. It is when someone quietly proves they no longer need them. If we look a little deeper into what happens after that initial shock, we begin to see another psychological layer emerge. Something that is less visible but far more significant. What follows the moment of disbelief is often what psychologists refer to as a narcissistic injury. Now, this concept is important to understand because when most people think about someone leaving a relationship, they imagine sadness or heartbreak. But for someone with strong narcissistic traits, the internal reaction often takes a different form. The departure is not first processed as grief over losing a connection. Instead, it is experienced as damage to the self-image. For the narcissistic mind, identity is constructed in a very particular way. Much of their sense of self depends on how they are perceived by others. Admiration, attention, emotional reactions, these things serve as mirrors that reflect back the image they want to believe about themselves. Powerful, desired, irreplaceable. So when someone walks away, especially someone who once invested deeply in them, the narcissist does not simply lose a relationship, they lose a mirror. And that loss creates a wound to the ego. But this wound rarely looks like vulnerability on the surface. In fact, it often produces the opposite reaction. The narcissist may become defensive, dismissive, or even hostile. They may attempt to reframe the situation in ways that protect their internal narrative. They might say the other person was weak, too sensitive, difficult, replaceable. These statements are not always deliberate lies meant to deceive others. Often, they function as psychological defenses meant to protect the narcissist from confronting something much more threatening, the possibility that someone saw through the image they were trying to project. You see, when an empath leaves after recognizing the deeper patterns of manipulation or emotional inconsistency, it introduces a dangerous idea into the narcissist's mind. The idea that they were truly seen. To someone who has spent much of their life constructing a carefully managed persona, being seen in this way can feel profoundly destabilizing. The ego responds quickly to that threat. It builds explanations, rationalizations, alternative stories. The narcissist might portray themselves as the victim of misunderstanding. They might insist that the relationship ended because the other person could not appreciate them. In some cases, they may even try to provoke a reaction from the person who left, hoping to re-establish some form of emotional engagement. Because even negative attention can temporarily soothe the injury, anger, arguments, attempts to explain. These responses reassure the narcissist that they still matter in the emotional world of the other person. It confirms that their influence remains intact, but when the empath truly disengages, something unusual happens. The usual emotional feedback loop disappears. There are no arguments to win, no explanations to dismantle, no emotional reactions to manipulate. The narcissist is left with a silence that cannot easily be interpreted as admiration or rejection. It is simply absence, and absence has a unique psychological power. Without an active opponent, the narcissist cannot easily defend against the discomfort rising inside. The ego injury remains present, but there is no immediate external conflict to distract from it. This is often when the internal narrative becomes more rigid. The narcissist may double down on their belief that they were wronged. They may tell the story repeatedly to friends, family, or new partners, reinforcing the idea that the person who left simply failed to recognize their value. But underneath that narrative, the injury remains unresolved. Because deep down, what disturbs the narcissistic mind is not just that someone left, it is that someone left without needing their validation anymore. And for a personality structure that relies heavily on controlling how others perceive them, that realization can be deeply unsettling. The narcissist may try to deny it, reshape it, or bury it beneath new sources of admiration. But the wound itself carries a quiet message the ego struggles to silence. Someone once believed in the image they projected, and then, one day, that belief disappeared. Once the initial shock has passed, and once the ego has begun defending itself against the injury of being left, another psychological shift often begins to unfold inside the narcissistic mind. And this is where the dynamic becomes particularly paradoxical, because the very person the narcissist once dismissed, criticized, or took for granted can suddenly become the person they cannot stop thinking about. From the outside, this may look confusing. After all, if the narcissist seems so detached during the relationship, why would they now become mentally preoccupied with someone who has already walked away? Why would they? The answer lies in how attention and psychological significance operate in the narcissistic structure. Narcissists tend to organize their relationships around influence. What matters to them, often unconsciously, is not connection but control over emotional movement. They become accustomed to provoking reactions, admiration, reassurance, arguments, apologies, explanations. Arguments, apologies, explanations. Each reaction confirms that they still occupy space in the other person's mind. But when someone truly walks away, something unusual happens. The emotional feedback loop collapses. The narcissist may attempt at first to reinitiate the familiar patterns. Tis a message here, a comment there, perhaps even subtle attempts to provoke jealousy or curiosity. These behaviors are not always about reconciliation. Often they are about restoring psychological relevance. They want to see if they can still move you. But if the impa maintains distance, if the responses do not come, if the emotional engagement remains absent, then a different process begins. The narcissist starts thinking about you more frequently than before. This is not necessarily because they have suddenly developed deeper empathy or emotional awareness. Rather, it is because the unresolved nature of the departure creates cognitive tension. The human mind has difficulty letting go of situations it cannot fully explain or control. For narcissistic personalities, this tension can be particularly strong. Their internal narrative once positioned them as the central figure in the relationship, the one with authority, the one who decided the pace and direction of the emotional exchange. Your departure disrupts that narrative. The mind begins searching for explanations. They may replay conversations in their memory. They may analyze the final moments of the relationship, trying to identify where the dynamic shifted. They may even revisit old messages, photographs, or memories, not necessarily out of nostalgia, but out of a need to reconstruct the story in a way that restores their sense of coherence. In psychological terms, this is the mind attempt to resolve what is known as a narcissistic rupture. The difficulty lies in the fact that the usual strategies do not work here. If you were still arguing with them, they could reinterpret your anger as proof of your emotional investment. If you were pleading for understanding, they could position themselves as the one with authority. But when someone leaves quietly and maintains that distance, the narcissist is left with a question they cannot easily answer. Why did their influence stop working? And this question can linger in subtle but persistent ways. You may appear in their thoughts unexpectedly. Something in their environment, a place, a phrase, a song, might remind them of the connection that once existed. Then each reminder brings back the unresolved tension of the unanswered question. The irony here is profound. During the relationship, the empath often spent countless hours trying to understand the narcissist's behavior, trying to interpret the contradictions and emotional distance. But after the departure, the roles quietly reverse. Now it is the narcissist who begins wondering about the empath, not necessarily out of love, and not always out of regret, but out of psychological curiosity and wounded control. Because the most unsettling realization for someone who depends on emotional influence is this: there was once a person who responded to them deeply, and now that person has become someone they can no longer reach. And sometimes the most persistent thoughts are not about the people we controlled. They are about the ones who quietly proved we never truly did. As this psychological tension continues to grow, another stage often begins to emerge inside the narcissist's mind. And this stage is not driven by reflection or emotional growth. It is driven by something much more immediate, the urgent need to regain control over the narrative. When someone walks away from a narcissist, the event, does not remain private for long within their internal world. The narcissistic personality is deeply concerned with perception, how they are seen, how they are interpreted, and how their identity is maintained in the eyes of others. So when a relationship ends in a way they did not fully control, it creates a risk. The risk is not just personal rejection. The risk is exposure. Because if someone leaves quietly, with clarity, and without returning to the familiar cycle of conflict, there is a possibility that others might begin to question what really happened. And for the narcissistic mind, uncertainty about reputation can feel profoundly threatening. So the narcissist begins doing something very strategic, often without consciously realizing the deeper motivation behind it. They begin rewriting the story. This rewriting can take many forms. Sometimes it appears subtle. They may casually mention that the other person was emotionally unstable or overly sensitive. They might suggest that the relationship became exhausting because they were constantly being misunderstood. In other cases, the narrative becomes more dramatic, portraying themselves as the one who endured mistreatment. What matters here is not the specific version of the story. What matters is control over the meaning of the ending. Psychologically, this process functions as a protective mechanism. If the narcissist can successfully shape how others interpret the breakup, then the internal discomfort created by the loss of control becomes easier to manage. The story becomes a shield, but there is another layer beneath this behavior that is worth understanding. The narcissist is not only trying to convince others, they are also trying to convince themselves. Because the departure of someone who once offered deep emotional investment introduces a difficult possibility that something in their own behavior contributed to the loss. For many narcissistic personalities, confronting that possibility directly would require dismantling parts of the self-image they have spent years constructing. So instead of reflection, the mind chooses narrative management. And this is where something interesting often happens. Even while the narcissist is publicly explaining the relationship in ways that protect their identity, internally the questions do not fully disappear. They may insist to others that the person who left was replaceable, yet at the same time they might continue checking whether that person has moved on. They may dismiss the relationship outwardly, while still feeling a quiet curiosity about what the empath is doing now. This contradiction reveals an important psychological truth. The story they tell the world is not always the same story that continues unfolding inside their mind. While narratives can protect the ego, they do not always resolve the deeper disturbance created by loss of influence. The narcissist may find new relationships, new sources of attention, new environments where their identity can be reinforced. But somewhere in the background of their psychological landscape remains the memory of a person who eventually stopped responding to the story they were trying to tell. And that memory can linger longer than they expect. Not because the narcissist has suddenly become emotionally transformed, but because the ending of that relationship introduced something they rarely encounter, a situation where their version of events no longer determined the outcome. The empath simply stepped out of the narrative. And when someone removes themselves from a story you believed you were controlling, it leaves behind a quiet and persistent question. The story was no longer theirs to shape. What part of it might have actually been true? As time can't to pass, another psychological response often begins to take shape inside the narcissist's mind, one that can appear confusing from the outside. Because after the narratives have been constructed, after the explanations have been shared with others, there is frequently a moment when the narcissist begins searching for something new. Not necessarily a new relationship in the traditional sense, but a new source of emotional validation. To understand why this happens, we have to recognize an important psychological dynamic within narcissistic personality structures. The sense of identity is not fully generated from within. Instead, it is constantly reinforced through external responses, through admiration, attention, admiration again, and sometimes even through conflict. This external feedback is often referred to as narcissistic supply. It is the emotional energy that stabilizes their self-image. When the empath was still present in the relationship, that supply often existed in abundance. The empath cared deeply. They listened. They tried to understand. Even their frustration or attempts to repair the relationship kept emotional attention flowing toward the narcissist. In other words, the narcissist remained psychologically central. But when the empath walks away and truly disengages, that stream of attention disappears. The silence that replaces it can feel surprisingly destabilizing, so the narcissistic mind begins looking elsewhere. Sometimes this search is immediate. They may quickly form new connections, presenting themselves with the same charm and emotional intensity that once drew the empath. In a first glance, it can appear as if they have moved on effortlessly, as if the previous relationship meant very little. But psychologically, the situation is often more complicated, because new attention does not always erase the memory of lost attention. What it does instead is temporarily distract from it. Each new admirer, each new conversation, each new person who expresses interest serves as a kind of emotional mirror. It reflects back the image the narcissist wants to maintain about themselves, that they are desirable, captivating, impossible to replace. And for a while, this reflection can feel convincing, but the deeper issue remains unresolved. Because what made the empath different was not simply that they offered attention. It was that they offered depth of attention. It was that they offered depth of attention, tried to understand the narcissist beyond the surface. They invested emotionally in ways that were patient, persistent, and often forgiving. And that kind of attention is not easily replicated. So even while new sources of admiration appear, there can still be subtle moments when the narcissist compares. They may notice that the emotional connection with new people feels lighter, more superficial, easier to manage, but also less substantial. This realization rarely leads to open acknowledgement. Instead, it tends to remain in the background of their experience. The narcissist continues seeking validation, continuing the cycle of admiration and attention that reinforces their identity. But occasionally, something reminds them of the person who once engaged with them on a deeper level. Perhaps it is the way the empath understood their moods without explanation. Perhaps it is the patience they showed during moments when others would have simply walked away. Perhaps it is the realization that the empath saw both the charm and the contradictions, and stayed longer than most people would have. These memories do not always produce regret in the traditional sense, but they do produce contrast, and contrast has a quiet psychological power. It highlights the difference between attention that is easily obtained and attention that was on TV invested. One is plentiful but shallow. The other was rare but difficult to sustain. And somewhere within the narcissist's internal landscape, that distinction can remain present long after the relationship has ended, because attention can be replaced. Admiration can be replaced. But the experience of someone who genuinely tried to understand you before finally walking away, that kind of presence is far more difficult to replicate. And sometimes the mind recognizes that truth long after the opportunity to repair it has already passed. After a period of searching for replacement sources of admiration, a more unsettling process often begins within the narcissist's mind. It is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but its effects are profound. They start to realize that something has been irrevocably lost. A presence, a depth of connection, a reflection of themselves that no new attention can recreate. This is the point where self-reflection begins. Though it is rarely conscious in the traditional sense. It is not introspection in the empathic, honest way most of us practice, but a forced confrontation with absence. Inside, there is a silent questioning, why did they leave? How could I have lost someone so important? How did someone who seemed to need me so little wield such influence over my life? The narcissist begins to feel the weight of their own limitations, the cracks in the carefully constructed armor of their identity. These cracks were always there, but the empath's departure has illuminated them, exposing vulnerabilities they usually mask with charm, deflection, and control. The narcissist now faces the uncomfortable reality that their emotional life has been more shallow than they allowed themselves to admit. They realized that their sense of self, so dependent on others' attention, was in part an illusion, fragile and contingent. Every relation's tip that followed the empath may have provided momentary validation, but it also underscores the irreplaceability of that previous connection. The mind struggles to reconcile this paradox. The abundance of attention cannot fill the absence of depth, and the ease of admiration cannot replicate authentic engagement. This stage is often marked by internal tension and restlessness. They might replay past interactions repeatedly, scrutinizing each detail for missteps or signs that the empath was not fully aware of the manipulations. They may attempt to rationalize or rewrite the narrative to preserve a sense of control, but the core truth persists. They cannot recreate what was lost, and though they may not articulate it aloud, a subtle sense of self-doubt begins to emerge. What is especially striking about this phase is the narcissist's growing awareness of the empath's boundaries, the same boundaries they once ignored or dismissed. The empath's ability to walk away demonstrates a strength they cannot replicate. For the narcissist, this is disorienting. Control was their comfort, manipulation, their currency. When someone departs without fear, without resentment, without needing to provoke them back, it challenges their worldview. It reveals a level of autonomy they cannot dominate, a psychological power they cannot undermine. As days turn into weeks, this internal confrontation may deepen. The narcissist experiences the emotional vacuum left behind, a silence where once there was connection, engagement, and energy flowing toward them. They are forced to face the limits of their influence, the consequences of their choices, and the rarity of the emotional presence they lost. Unlike ordinary losses, this is not merely about missing attention or validation. It is about understanding, at a fundamental level, what they are incapable of recreating. A relationship with depth, pen, authenticity, and unmanipulated care. The realization can be destabilizing because it is both subtle and absolute. They may seek ways to regain control, to reconnect, to reassert dominance, but these attempts are often hollow. They are not seeking the same person. They are seeking the emotional experience they once had, a mirror to their self that only a super empath could provide. The internal tension persists, not because of guilt in the conventional sense, but because the narcissist is acutely aware that they have lost something rare, something that cannot be replaced, something that exposes the very fragility of their constructed self. This phase concludes with a stark understanding. The empath's departure is a permanent marker, a boundary that cannot be crossed. And in that permanence, the narcissist comes face to face with the limits of their own identity, the consequences of their choices, and the profound truth that not all connections can be manipulated or controlled. The lesson they never wanted to learn is now unavoidable. True emotional depth cannot be owned, only witnessed, and once it is gone, it leaves an indelible mark that even the most calculated self-interest cannot erase. What happens next inside the narcissist mind is subtle, almost invisible to an outside observer. Yet it is perhaps the most profound stage of their internal unraveling. After the initial shock, the self-recriminations, and the search for replacements, the narcissist begins to encounter a deeper, more existential realization. This is not simply about losing attention or admiration. It is about confronting the fact that they have destroyed something real, something irreplaceable, something that reflected the best version of themselves back to them. The super empath, by their very presence, provided a mirror that was honest, unmanipulated, and deeply attuned. And once that mirror, gone, the narcissist is left to stare into the hollow reflection of their own constructed identity. At this point, the narcissist often oscillates between denial and awareness. On one hand, they attempt to rationalize, to convince themselves that the loss is trivial, that the empath was too sensitive or too independent to truly matter, But rationalizations begin to falter because the evidence is unambiguous. The empath's absence is permanent, and nothing, no charm, no manipulation, no replacement attention, can restore what was lost. The mind starts to dwell on what could have been, on the moments when a choice, a word, or an action could have changed the trajectory. Every memory of intimacy, trust, or vulnerability is now filtered through the lens of regret, magnifying the loss in a way that mere attention or validation cannot assuage. This is where the narcissist encounters a rare kind of self-confrontation. They are forced to see the consequences of their patterns, their manipulation, their disregard for genuine connection. Unlike previous relationships where externalizing blame or rewriting narratives could preserve their ego, the super empath departure makes this impossible. They cannot convince themselves that the fault lies entirely elsewhere, because the empath's leaving was not a reaction to circumstance or manipulation. It was a boundary, a demonstration of self-respect, a refusal to participate in the narcissist's world of control. Emotionally, this realization is destabilizing. The narcissist experiences what can only be described as a psychological vacuum. The emptiness is not merely about absence, but about the recognition of their own limitations, their inability to generate authenticity, to sustain depth, to experience relational honesty. Then, losing the empath, they confront the ultimate truth. For all their cleverness, charm, and influence, Tay cannot manufacture the very thing that made the relationship meaningful. It is an internal reckoning, one that shakes the foundations of their self-image, even if it does not yet manifest as true accountability or change. In practical terms, the narcissist may attempt to regain control, to reinsert themselves into the empath's life, or to manipulate other relationships, to mimic the depth they lost. But these efforts are ultimately futile, because what they are seeking cannot be copied or coerced. The empath's unique presence, intuitive, discerning, emotionally sovereign, is not something that can be duplicated. And the more the narcissist chases this phantom, the more aware they become of the irreplaceable nature of what they destroyed. At the core of this stage is a profound lesson about the limits of manipulation and control. The narcissist is confronted with a reality they cannot dominate, the autonomy of another human being, the integrity of someone who refuses to mirror their constructed self. And in this confrontation, the narcissist comes face to face with a rare and uncomfortable truth. Some losses are permanent, some relationships cannot be replicated, and some consequences are irreversible. Ultimately, this internal reckoning leaves the narcissist with a haunting realization. They have not merely lost attention or validation. They have destroyed a connection that reflected authenticity, empathy, and relational truth. And no amount of charm, strategy, or external admiration can replace it. The weight of this understanding may never lead to genuine transformation, but it is undeniable. The narcissist now knows, at a deep psychological level, that they have caused the loss of something profoundly rare, profoundly real, and profoundly real, and profoundly real, and profoundly human. This is the truth they cannot escape, and it is the truth that will shape every interaction, every memory, and every shadow of longing that follows. Destroying a super empath, the narcissist confronts the fragility of their own identity and the permanence of the love they were never capable of fully honoring.